It's great. I can see lots of people just joining us. So good morning, everyone, and a big welcome to this webinar from Data Protection Network. My name's Simon Blanchard. I'm a partner at DPN, and I've been with the business for about 9 years now. So for those of you that are not regulars with our webinars that are joining us for the first time, let me tell you just a little bit about us. We produce and publish a lot of practical, action-oriented guidance for organisations and updates too on changes either in the law or in recent cases. All on our website, you'll see dpnetwork.org.uk. And also we're a data protection consultancy and training organisation as well, who work with a wide range of organisations. So yeah, let me just pop a few slides on just to introduce the topic for you today. So our topic today is how to assess and manage data protection risks. The webinar is being recorded for you, so if you'd like to review it again or share it with colleagues or have another opportunity to take a look at a later date, you'll be able to do that. So just look out for an email that arrives around about this time tomorrow, about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Some of you have kindly submitted questions in advance, so thank you very much for doing that. They're always really useful. They help us kind of plan for the sessions. But you will have the opportunity to raise your questions during the webinar as well. So feel free to use the chat button if you want to pop any questions, and they'll be passed on to Robert, who's chairing. I'll introduce in just a moment. First of all, I'd just like to say a big thank you to our sponsor, who is OneTrust. So the OneTrust, the trust intelligence platform, gives business visibility, actionable insights and automation across privacy and data discovery and across GRC, ethics and ESG. So with OneTrust, businesses can go beyond compliance through transparency, choice and control. So OneTrust provides privacy and data governance automation to organisations, to help them better understand their data and also to meet their regulatory compliance obligations and to operationalise their kind of risk mitigation activities. And really, OneTrust is offering privacy management, data discovery and governance, consent and preferences. And you can see a link there to the website if anybody wants that. So I'd like now to introduce you to our panel of experts today. We've got a fabulous panel with us today. Really delighted to welcome all. First of all, I'd like to introduce our chairperson today, which is Robert. Robert, would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Simon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Senior Counsel with Privacy Partnership Law. I also chair the DPN Advisory Board, and I'm an Industry Commissioner for the Data and Marketing Commission. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. And also really pleased to welcome Fidelma Good. Fidelma, do you want to say a few words?
Thanks, Simon, and hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Fidelma Good. I'm an independent privacy consultant. Previously, I co-led PwC's data protection legal team. Like Robert, I have an association with the Data and Marketing Commission, having previously been a commissioner there. So I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today on my first webinar since I have set up my own business.
Fantastic. Great to have you with us today, Fidelma. Thank you very much. And last but by no means least, we have Joseph Byrne. Joe, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I'm Joseph Byrne, a Principal Solutions Engineer at OneTrust. So there's two parts to my role. The first part is to articulate the value of OneTrust, but the second part, which I think I like a bit more, is attending industry events, panels and conferences such as this one, and discussing popular topics in the privacy space. Lately, the dialogue has been pretty fierce, actually. Last week, I was at PrivSec North in Manchester on a few expert panels, and plenty of dialogue, conversation about risks, transfers, the new EU-US transfer law. So there's some great conversations going on the sort of scene at the moment, and great to be part of this one today.
Brilliant. Good to have you with us. Thanks a lot, Joe. So just wanted to very briefly set the scene for the discussion that we're going to have today with the panel. So about kind of the whole risk identification and assessment area. So just first, a very quick reminder about what organisations are required to do. So obviously follow the core data protection principles, and we're reminded obviously that GDPR is a principle-based regulation, which means that organizations need to be accountable for their activities, which means that they do need to be able to identify their risks, they need to be able to assess them, and to be able to put proportionate measures in place, measures and controls to be able to protect individuals against those risks. So the good news is that obviously we can take a proportionate approach to that as well. Let's say as it's principle based, we can take a proportionate approach to it based on the nature of the processing that we're doing, the size of the organization, etc. So just one more slide, I think we have. Just some of the things that maybe we'll talk about today as a panel, some of the things that we, again, that came up within our questions to consider. So do we, as organizations, do we know where our risks lie across, particularly if we've got, an organization that's got our risk spread across a large number of teams, maybe on a global basis, or in fact with subsidiary companies sometimes. So do we recognize, do we know where the risks lie? Are our data protection risks actually logged somewhere? Have we got actually a risk register or something that we log them in and rate them in? How do we go about grading them? So I think quite a bit of our discussion today will touch on this. How do we go about grading our data protection risks, and is the methodology that we use, is it sound? How do we go about prioritizing the key risks, and are we actually prioritizing what's most important? Are we really taking the right actions? Are we agreeing what those actions are and just making sure that those actions are completed on time so that we can mitigate any risks? Have we really got management buy-in, which obviously is going to be an important thing to move things forward? And have we agreed on which risks the business is prepared to accept? Because in some cases we might identify some maybe potentially smaller risks that the business says, okay, we'll accept that risk. And obviously recognizing that each organization's appetite for those risks could be different as well. Okay, so that's all the slides. I'm going to now hand you over to Robert, our chairperson, to open up the discussion today.
Yes, thank you, Simon. And literally picking up on the first of your bullet points you just had there, I'm going to ask, how do you identify and assess the different data protection risks in your organization? And I'll turn this first to you, Fidelma. How have you gone about helping organizations assess where the risks are, what they are?
Thanks, Robert, and a great question to kick off. And one of the key things, of course, is that risks for every business will be different. However, there will be commonality. And what we're looking at here in the context of privacy is really about the impact on the individual whose data is being processed, but also the risk of impact, as Jim has pointed out in the comments here, both positive and negative to the organization as well. So I think one of the challenges for businesses is actually integrating privacy considerations into their enterprise risk management, which typically looks at the risk or opportunities to the organization, but melding into that the risk of an impact on the individual. So specifically for me, this is about understanding your business and then assessing both the existing and the future risks that might impact the organization and the individual.
Thank you. Thank you. And Simon, what have you seen with your clients in terms of assessing risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you there, Fidelma. It is about being able to join up the dots, let's put it that way, so that you can understand privacy as one and data protection as one aspect of that. I mean, in terms of kind of how organizations go about it, there are a number of different approaches. I'm sure Joe can talk from a solution provider sort of perspective, but I've also seen organizations that potentially, again, some of the smaller organizations using methodologies like interviewing key people around the business to be able to understand what what data do they have, how are they using it, and from that point of view, in like we did talked about in a previous webinar, doing some data discovery activity, identifying your record of processing, and through that being able to identify the kind of risks that we have across the business, both existing risks and identifying new risks, and from that point of view being able to identify, okay, so what is it that we need to be concerned about, and conducting an assessment based on that, which might be under GDPR, a DPIA, data protection impact assessment, or something perhaps less formal, or I think somebody was mentioning before, the PIA as they use in the States, some kind of assessment methodology to be able to identify, so what do those risks look like, and so that we can put some level of priority and be able to work towards finding some suitable measures and controls to protect individuals.
And what about, Joe, how technology can help in that sort of mapping exercise?
Well, certainly, technology or software solutions can help you with that due diligence throughout the data lifecycle. And there's a few things I'll point out in particular. Your onboarding, when you're onboarding an IT asset or a third party, or you're considering a new processing activity, you must do those initial assessments to understand the types of data you're moving and if any initial risks are presenting. And there may be some you haven't even thought of yet, but they would come up through the course of an assessment. And then throughout the life cycle of that data or that processing activity, you need to revisit that, and then also be conscious of offboarding. At some point in time, you may stop using a process or a vendor or an IT asset. What are you going to do with that data? Just because you've stopped the process doesn't mean the risk has stopped. You need to do your final due diligence then, when you come to the end of the perhaps data lifecycle.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Some of the incidents that we've seen are because data has been allowed to sit for a long, long time on some drive that somebody's forgot about, and then it gets exposed. And thinking about the loss of control, Fidelma, what are the most common risks that you see around loss of control?
A great question, Robert. And one of the things I think people just don't recognize is that a significant number of risks arise through human error. So the whole contention of privacy here and underpinning it is education of people internally. And I think Simon may have some statistics to actually show this in the context of the types of data breaches that can arise. And you can see here that human error remains the cause of around 3/4 of data breaches reported to the ICO. I mean, that is a substantial figure when you look at it in the context of risk. So for me, I think those figures really are quite startling and well worth taking on board when organizations, both small and large, so I saw Ian's question there about smaller SMEs, what you are looking at doing to both understand and mitigate your risk.
Thank you. And when we try to manage this risk assessment process, where does ownership sit? Simon?
I think it's really important to make sure that your management team are fully aware of their obligations, the accountability requirements that we have in data protection regulation, particularly I'm thinking of UK and EU GDPR here particularly. But I think it kind of flows from the top, but equally it's important to identify kind of roles like data owners, data stewards, etc., so that you're clear on who takes responsibility. So let me give you an example. So if you're looking at your employee data, for example, protecting your employees, for example, you might identify that your head of HR or your HR director might be the data owner for that data set, for example, so that they will have responsibility for the processing that is carried out by their teams. So I think the principle of making sure that you've got clear an ownership model, and equally be very clear in terms of how the support works for those individuals. So who's going to explain the obligations that they have under data protection law? You may have either a legal team or a compliance team, privacy team, whatever you call them, that provide the second line support to those first line individuals. So I think if that helps, the approach kind of to around accountability and making sure that you've got clear ownership of those and clear support for those business owners as well. As long as, of course, the thing has been mentioned is training is obviously essential here. Training, policies, procedures, practices that guide people when they're processing data, so that we've got that base level of knowledge across the organisation.
And Fidelma, how do you get management engaged in this process?
So in that context, for me, I think one of the things that we are seeing is an increased level of understanding from senior executives, boards, and shareholders about the context and consideration that privacy needs to have in an organization. And you'll increasingly see in annual reports of big companies that they are dealing with privacy risk. I think that's one of the things that we are seeing. But in terms of how do you do that, again, I think it is back to education, and education is both bottom up and top down. And picking up on what Simon has said about roles and responsibilities, if in your organization you're operating a classic 3-level model of first line of defense, second line of defense, and third line of defense, one of the elements that I think is still emerging is giving the third line of defense a clear role in undertaking internal assessment of the level of compliance with privacy law. That third line of defense typically has a very good engagement model with senior executives. So I think it's ensuring that the clarity of roles and responsibilities, those accountability and responsibility considerations are understood throughout your entire organization. For me, typically I've used a RACI model, one which maps out responsibility, accountability, consultative roles or informed roles throughout the organization can really, really help get that message through to the senior level and get that buy-in.
Okay, thank you. And we've had a number of questions coming in about the best way to consider risks. And I'm going to ask you, Joe, this particular one. What's the best way to consider risks as a data processor as opposed to a controller? So where you might not have the risks necessarily mapped out on your roadmap.
Right, so a processor rather than a controller. You need to engage the controller and understand the level of protection they've agreed or the level of adequacy they've agreed in order to get consent to manage that data. You need to understand, I suppose, the consequences of a breach and how that would reflect on you. The controller is ultimately accountable, but you need to understand how that would leave you exposed. And then you need to maintain that level of adequacy throughout the engagement with the controller. It may start off with best intentions, but further down the line as a processor, perhaps their certifications have expired, or perhaps they're starting to do things in a slightly different way. They need to make sure throughout the engagement they're aligned with the controller. A controller processor relationship is an interesting one as well, because it may need to come to an end at a certain point in time if the controller is no longer satisfied that the processor is managing the data to an appropriate standard, or maybe they've been acquired, or they've got new cloud servers, or the data's moved. Ultimately, the controller is accountable, so they need to make sure they do their due diligence with that third party. But there's other interesting things that pop up as well in terms of risk and third party management. These are some of the more exciting ones, like sanctions lists, politically exposed persons, corruption, and also state-owned companies that may not come to mind initially, but these are all things that may present risk even though they're not directly related to the processing that's being carried out. So there's a broader due diligence question around how the organization is run that also needs to be considered. Yeah,
and I'm going to try and put 2 or 3 comments and questions together here. So several questions have come in from individuals who are with small organizations. They're saying we don't have a big budget. We've got manual data as well as electronic data. I'm not even sure where to begin. I'm going to just make some comments myself, and then I'll get Fidelma to jump in afterwards. But certainly I find with a lot of smaller organizations that I advise, or indeed that I'm external DPO for, is that if you haven't done an assessment or an audit or whatever you choose to call it, please do one as soon as you can, because you're obligated as the controller to understand your data estate, to understand the type of data that you have, whether it's regular names and addresses or is it special category or sensitive data. You need to know what you've got and where it's come from and with whom you share it, because that should be in your ROPA. If you don't know the answer to those questions, you won't have a privacy notice that is worth the paper it's either written on or not written on, and you simply will not be in compliance with applicable law. You can't even get to the risk till you know what you've got, and that's essentially what Simon was saying at the beginning. How you record it, and that was one of the other questions, is if we don't have a big budget, is there something which we could do simply? And the answer is you might well create an Excel spreadsheet. You might have some form of internal SharePoint or even a Word document with columns that assess risk and simply say this is high, medium or low. The whole point of the privacy impact assessment and the DPIA, as we now call it, is that it is a risk management tool that enables you to understand, again, the who, what, when, why, and how of everything we have. So it doesn't have to be ultra sophisticated for a smaller organization, but you have to do it and be on the journey. I know from experience that when things go wrong, the regulator is more likely to look favorably on you if you could show you were trying to do the right thing rather than having simply sat on your hands. So I know sounds like I am lecturing you, but please do something. Fidelma.
I'm loving that, Robert. In fact, you've picked up there on something I'd written down in front of me, which echoes what you were saying. I don't know if you've heard the Rudyard Kipling quote was, "I knew 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names were what and why and when and how and where and who." And that is absolutely it in the context of getting your hands around and understanding your own data assets. Yeah, a simple spreadsheet, a simple Word document, exactly as you've said, is the way to go, because unless you understand it, you can't manage it. The thing I would add to that, Robert, is, of course, simply creating it isn't enough. You need to keep it alive. And what you need to do is also, once you have understood your assets and hopefully begun to understand some of the risks that might exist in having those data assets, is putting in place as clear as possible a plan to mitigate the risks. And the one I have come across most, Robert, and it's something you touched on earlier, is over retention of data. The words I have heard most frequently is, well, we're keeping it just in case. Yeah, those are the sorts of considerations and approaches that just increases risk. So, I think you've just hit the nail on the head. Just get in there and understand your data, and the simplest form can actually be incredibly revealing and helpful.
And thinking about forms, Joe, I think you've kindly provided some examples of registers.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk us through what we've got.
Yeah, so we've an example of a risk matrix. So this is a tool you can use to score your risk in terms of likelihood and impact. And you can also vary the sort of color representation as well. So this, when you're looking at risks within the organization or where they manifest in processes and vendors and so on, gives you a very clear idea of where it is just visually. And these in various software forms are configurable. So 4x4 is probably where most people start: low, medium, high, very high. But you can refine those to suit the approach your organization is taking. And we should see, I think we have a slide that shows an extract from a risk register, which is next. So there's an example there of how the risks manifest. Now, these are all medium because it's just a snapshot. And when I created this, I didn't want to expose organization names and so on. But typically in a genuine risk register, you'd see a risk profile of various risk levels: high, very high, and medium. But what's useful here is you start to get visibility. And with this type of data, when it's classified in this way, you can immediately start to report on it, report on the risk type, report on the severity, maybe how long it's been there, whether it's been actioned, these sorts of things as well, or pick out different parts of the organization that the risks refer to. And if I may, I just want to take a small step back when we were talking about getting started. There are sophisticated tools out there, which of course are very useful, but as Fidelma was saying, Fidelma, it's just important, and Robert, it's important to make a start. And there are some great resources available for free, particularly from the ICO, that'll help you make that start and get that spreadsheet or that system working. And certainly in my role, when I come into an organization and they've made a solid attempt to get their program going, even if it's with spreadsheets, that puts you at a huge advantage then if you want to transition to software, whereas as opposed to if you just started from scratch or not maintained. And just one other point I wanted to make about when we were talking about audits. So my dad was an auditor and a quality manager in construction. And when he used to train some of the people that joined the organization, sort of junior engineers, he'd ask them a question like, so a big load of concrete or steel has arrived, like, what do you do? And they'd say, well, we'd start verifying the specification, or we'd check this and this. And he said, no, you look at it. Go out and look at it. And that's, for most organizations, the first place to start with their data. Take a step back and look at what's there. I used to do this exercise when I worked in SharePoint, when we were trying to consolidate data systems, and I'd get about 1,000 post-it notes and say, what systems do you have? So there may be 15 of those. And where does data sit? And map that out to understand what they actually have. And what was interesting with that would be like, well, where does this sit? Maybe it was human resources data. They'd be like, oh, that sits in this system, but also this system and this system. So until you do that proper audit and get visibility of that data, you won't be in a great position then to start understanding the risk it presents to you. So there was just some thoughts I had from the conversation we had leading up to here.
Fabulous. And I think I'm going to ask Fidelma to comment on this. Several people have said, are there any statistics about the link between over-retention and risk/data breaches? I think before we started, Fidelma, you said you'd found one or two good resources that had done analysis on this topic.
Well, there is one very interesting document I found, which is produced by the American Information Accountability Foundation, IAF, not an organization I've come across that much, but they have a very interesting document that's available online called Risk of What? And it actually sort of, in the context of privacy risk consideration, actually looks at this issue of the challenge of integrating privacy risk into enterprise risk. Now, I know from the questions we've got here, Robert, that there are a lot of people at smaller and medium-sized enterprises, but notwithstanding that it's talking about enterprise risk, I think that document is really worth a read. It's a bit heavy, but it talks about really understanding the impact, and both positive and negative, of processing activities that are taking place on personal data, whether that is an impact on the individual or on the organization. Statistically, they don't come through with that much, but there is also on the IAPP website a publication from KPMG and the IAPP, which is the Privacy Risk Study 2023. And that again is well worth looking at.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just going to shift gear because some of the questions we've had in are about parallel risks, particularly because it's a hot topic, the use or reliance upon AI. And again, apologies from the chair for putting in my thoughts, but I have found that over the years of doing what we used to call PIA, and now DPIA, as you talk your way through the project that you're about to launch, hopefully you're doing this before the project has been launched, it's inevitable that one of the questions you'll have is, what's the lawful ground that we are relying upon for what we are about to do? Is this proportionate? Is it necessary? Would the individual, if we're relying on legitimate interests, expect this to be happening? Have we done a legitimate interests assessment? And you almost step out of your PIA and then do an LIA. And then you come back into the process again. And as you are gathering the information from the relevant stakeholders, you discover that, yes, we are going to be transferring the personal data outside of the UK or outside of the EU. Have we done a transfer risk assessment? Or you discover that the product is being aimed at vulnerable persons or children. Have we done a privacy by default assessment? And what I'm seeing us moving towards is a general approach to assessing and managing risk. Some will be privacy risk, and one of the questions we had was, how will you assess risk for reputational issues for the business? How will you assess financial risk and harm? And I wondered, well, I think we are getting to a situation where it's never just about privacy when you're doing the DPIA. You're drifting out into cyber resilience, AI, etc. For those smaller organizations that are already worrying about the basic risk assessment, I'm afraid it appears this is just going to get worse. Or will the UK simply say, no, in all of these circumstances, you don't need to do any assessment at all. It's absolutely fine. Go ahead, when the rest of the world is actually imposing risk assessments. Just throwing out a whole load of thoughts. What do you think, Simon, to where we are heading with this process?
Wow, that's a very broad topic I think you've introduced there, Robert. I'm just trying to figure out which bit to pick off first. But I think you're right. For smaller organisations, it can seem a bit mind-boggling, perhaps, and the need to start somewhere is vital. But if we just look at kind of the broader kind of risk profile, you've touched on things like. I'm just wondering, where do you want? Is there a particular area you'd like me to comment on, Robert? Out of all of that.
Well, I'd certainly like to know how you're dealing with AI risks. Yeah,
so with AI, I think there's, if we look at it from that point of view, we're looking at where AI, particularly from a privacy perspective, where AI may impact on the individual. Because I'm seeing two kinds of AI. We're seeing obviously there's lots of chat around the generative AI, which may use individuals' data, and whereby there might be an outcome on the individual, either in terms of the use of their data for modelling purposes, or in fact where it might then need to lead to some kind of action that might affect them as an individual. So those are the ones that I think we're particularly looking at, is where they affect individuals. And I wanted to just be clear on that, because I'm also seeing that businesses are doing quite a lot of AI, particularly, to be fair, probably more in the machine learning space, that is actually doing it for optimization of the business. So they're doing it not necessarily using personal data, but they're mining data, shall we say, in more sophisticated, clever ways, often using machine learning that is not directly impacting the individual. So I'm going to put those to one side for the moment. We still need to consider them from a risk point of view, but from a privacy perspective, we're more mindful on where they affect individuals. So from that point of view, I think we need to understand, A, what are our business using? What's our own business using from an AI point of view? Are we developing AI tools, for example, or are we using third-party tools? Because there's a number of third-party tools out there that can be used. And again, it's about understanding, okay, so what data are we actually using? How have we trained the model? What outputs are we getting from that model? Have we assessed whether those outputs are fair and reasonable and accurate, for that matter? So it's a lot of the fundamentals that we talk about in data protection world. We just apply that lens to the world of AI. But equally, I think the thing that maybe some businesses are less mindful of that I'm seeing is where your supplier chain. So I'm thinking, first of all, from where you're a controller, we're seeing an increase in the number of tools that are being provided by your suppliers. And we think initially, I guess, of your Microsofts of the world and Amazon, AWS, for example, and lots of other big tech companies are providing AI-oriented tools. And obviously, if you're using those kind of platforms, have you again assessed what impact there might be by those providers naturally providing your employees with those tools as a result of you engaging with those platforms? Do you understand how your people are now using those tools that maybe didn't include AI a couple of years back, perhaps? So those are the things I'd look at from an AI perspective. But again, using the tried and tested approaches of understanding risk management from the individual's point of view is going to be important here. But I take also the point that I think Fidelma mentioned, that we need to consider it both from the point of view of the individual, but also take into account, so what impact could this have on the organisation? How might it affect our reputation if something happened? Are we being transparent enough? There's a number of different perspectives we need to look at this from.
And Robert, Fidelma, yeah, please.
Yeah. I was going to come in there. This, I think, then leads us in, and you were already explaining, Robert, about this fact that privacy is now integrating into all other aspects of business. But with this AI piece, we move into the consideration of ethics. And I think AI is really giving rise to those considerations, about the use of data and the ethical implications. One of the things within that then is the issue about bias emerging in some of the AI issues, and attendees have probably heard about some of the case studies where the bias is built in through the data that is used to train the system. And I think it's really interesting for me. We're really at the forefront of a very exciting technical revolution, but still the same principles apply. Rubbish in, rubbish out, or as the Americans say, garbage in, garbage out. We cannot move away from some of the fundamental principles that focus in on data, its accuracy, its completeness, its consistency, and tying that in then with some of the core privacy considerations, which is, where did you get it from? What did you say you were going to do with that data at the point it was captured? And to the point you were making, Robert, is the processing you're about to undertake something that the individual would have anticipated at the point? And that's the one I think is becoming increasingly difficult as data gathering, storage, and management becomes cheaper and cheaper, and the technology for processing greater volumes of data exists. We have this intersection then of the ethical, the legal considerations alongside capability, which could be enormous. I don't have an answer, by the way, but it's all of the things that we need to be considering. And I think this is like we're at the cusp of something terribly exciting, but also terribly daunting.
Yeah, and sorry for all the cliches, but hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I know every time I've had an incident, you think, I wish I had done something, not done something. And I think that's part of the value of doing an assessment, is to understand what you've got and what have you got that is high risk and how would you manage that. And even if it goes wrong, the regulator is more likely to take a more approach than where you've done nothing at all. I think there was a few years ago, I had a client of mine where the general counsel could not get the management to take this seriously and said, can you do me a memo or an opinion that is called what is the worst that can happen? And you look at it, and I know one of the questions we've had about examples of what's the worst that can happen when you have got old data. I think pre-GDPR, there was a UK travel agency, and I think they got hacked, and what was lost was credit card details about individuals that was so old that the cards no longer worked. But the ICO said, why have you got data that is of no value? That's why I'm going to do, a bigger fine than you would have otherwise had. Yeah. So there's a prime example of where you might persuade your team that keeping data just because actually makes the data toxic and frankly of no value. I've got on that, Joe, when you've identified the risks and looking at your registers and scoring, what do you do when you've now identified that we've got X risks that are high or even extremely high? What do you do internally?
Well, there's a couple of approaches. With our platform, it gives you guidance. So it will tell you a mitigation approach and it will recommend controls. But you can also do that yourself outside of software. You can understand what risk that's presenting to the organization. Firstly, determine if that's a risk you can tolerate, or you're prepared to tolerate or happy to tolerate. And you can accept that risk. If it's not, determine what you're going to do about it. That could be implement controls from standard frameworks or your own internal approach, and then manage the residual risk down to a level that's acceptable. The other thing you can do is, if you can't mitigate the risk and it's too high, you could consider stopping that processing altogether and just drawing a line under it. And it comes back to the sort of recurring theme we've had. Why are we doing this anyway? If you're doing something that's presenting considerable risk to the organization and you're not, or you don't feel you're getting the required value back for that, maybe just stop. Yeah.
And I think that's a good example. Weatherspoons was one that everybody has talked about, where shortly before or shortly after GDPR, they realized they had got data on people who'd bought a pint in a pub from like 10 years ago. Why do you need that? You're actually holding unlawful data. So I think they just deleted everything that was, over 2 years old. And if you've not got it, there's nothing to lose control of. So that's another good reason why you shouldn't be keeping data just because you never know when it might come in useful, as Fidelma was saying. How do we track known risks over time? I think, Joe, I'm going to come back to you again. I think you said, or it might have been even Fidelma, but these assessments are living and breathing. What should you be doing to ensure that what you've got as a register is a living and breathing document?
Well, one of the prominent things to do is to assign each risk an owner or a team that's responsible for it, so that it doesn't just get lost in the risk register. Then you would capture your gross or initial inherent risk, your net risk as you deal with it, and then your target where you want to get to. And it's very important, regardless of how you're doing this, to try and maintain some sort of audit trail. So where you started, where you got to, where you finished, and who was involved. Because then if someone then inherits the risk or becomes the new owner, they can see how they got there. Or if they're trying to understand why the risk was accepted or tolerated. They can see the reasons why. So you need a risk register, and you need some method of reviewing those risks periodically, and then you also need a method of capturing the audit. Another neat thing we can do is we can set in our software, we call them automation rules. So it'll tell you if something has gone out of tolerance. So if you're a large or large organization, you may have thousands of risks. Keeping track of all of that data is challenging in a spreadsheet, but having this sort of data shepherd, I call it, it's not the greatest analogy, but it's watching over the risks and is going to highlight something that's gone out of tolerance so you can deal with it, is going to add some value as well.
It sounds like a data angel, Joe, the way you describe it there, which I quite like. The other thing, Robert, for me, just in that context that I have seen make a difference is assigning those risk responsibilities, those issues, to a role, not to a named individual. Yeah, because individuals move, they progress through an organization and out of an organization. If it's assigned to Fidelma Good and I move on, then your risk remains unowned. It needs to be with a role. And that process for me of linking those responsibilities in the context of privacy, risk, responsibility, and a role description is where I have often seen a big gap with organizations. Very much to what Joe was saying, that understanding that someone has that this is their responsibility is absolutely key. And that again has to be supported through the organizational structure and the management structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could I have a little bit, if that's okay,
yeah,
Robert? Just
jump
to that
in, yes,
kind of
please,
discussion.
Simon.
And I just want to reinforce the point that often organisations think that the how they actually mitigate and tackle the risks is going to be either complex or expensive. And I find that actually in many situations it's not as complex or expensive. In fact, quite often it doesn't cost anything, or it can be relatively straightforward. So let's give a few examples maybe. A lack of transparency, which we touched on before. Are people aware how you're using the data? Is it something that can be achieved by updating your notifications or when people sign up, for example, for services, or from updating your privacy notice? Those can be relatively straightforward, quick things to do. They can't always be resolved from that, to be fair, if you're doing something new that people aren't aware of. But those are some things you can do. We touched on people using more complex data sets. Well, have you assessed whether we need all of that data in our AI model or for the new processing that we're doing? Quite often, there's a solution I find in just minimizing the data. Let's take out the email address. Let's take out the data that we don't need, and therefore we reduce the risks. This, again, over retention. Are we going to be keeping it too long? Make sure that we've agreed how long we'll keep it. And again, just by things like training and policies, things like that. Have we trained people on the new process? Have we got a procedure documented? Quite often there's some relatively simple, you could call them a quick fix. I don't want to be thought of that way, but they're not simple and quick fixes that your data owners and their teams, with the support of your privacy people. However, again, for smaller organizations or larger, they just bear in mind they don't always have to be big and complex. There can be some quite quick things that can be done to reduce your risk profile.
And if I may just talk about enforcement, it's quite a strong word, but we've talked about policy, but policy is only useful if it's enforced. And enforcement, you have to think about the type of organization you're in. So earlier in my career, I worked in the oil industry, and everybody did what they were told all of the time. Like all of the time. Even simple policies like holding the handrail on stairs, people did it. And there was a policy of intervention. If you saw someone walking down the stairs not holding the handrail, you had to intervene. And if someone saw you not intervene, you'd get reprimanded. But everyone did what they were told all of the time. Moving into software, not this company, of course, my previous software career, everybody didn't do what they were told. So you need to try and figure out ways to get them to do what they're told and enforce those policies if you actually want them to be effective. Whether that's regular training or regular announcements at all hands, or maybe just ad hoc, someone does a walk around and points out things that people need to address. That helps too, but get people conscious and get people doing it, or it's not going to add any value.
Yeah, and I literally yesterday was dealing with a an incident, which is the second occasion that the HR department has sent a contract for an employee to the wrong employee. And it gets closed down very quickly. But I just said to the HR manager, this is the second occasion. What are we doing to ensure that this does not happen again? Because, you know, I have got to do an internal report as to how this risk occurred and how we are managing it. And yeah, you do need to keep revisiting it. I don't know what your experience has been, Fidelma, of where the DPO has felt this is a risk too far and I need to consult with the ICO. Have you been involved in any of those situations?
Yes, I have. And I think one of the things that continuously is driven home to me, Robert, is how lucky we are with our regulator, that it is truly an approachable regulator. And organizations that I have guided in that have universally found that the exchange and the process, of communication is a positive one. In fact, increased by being transparent rather than trying to remain anonymous and going in with just an anonymous process. So I think we're incredibly lucky here in the UK with the regulator we have. I think also that process of raising the fact that we have a regulator with whom we can engage has actually also helped organizations themselves come to grips with and understand that risk profile. Yeah, the very fact that you go to senior management to say, look, I think it's come to this point and this is the path that we're following, to get guidance from our regulator really, really has made a difference. And one thing that Joe said that tipped off another thing in my mind that I have found in this context of risk and an organization understanding the engagement that it has with individuals and their personal data is a significant number of senior execs that I have spoken with have themselves never signed up to become a customer of their own organization. They haven't used the interfaces that the company has. They haven't actually looked at the experience that the individual gets from trying to engage with the organization. And in my view, an organization cannot manage that risk without understanding it through the eyes of the data subject. And if that was just one thing that people take away, it is about stop navel gazing and go out and experience your organization through your customer's lens.
And actually that's a really good point. I suspect many of you have seen that the ICO recently published a position paper with the Competition and Markets Authority around the topic of harmful online choice architecture, saying we really do not like organizations who are nudging consumers to click the accept button or making the consent process bundled or overcomplicated, etc. And yeah, if you used your own website as a manager, I think it would be quite eye-opening. And I often say, as the advisor, here's what we can do as the business. But if I think about this as to how I would feel as the individual, I'm not comfortable with that invasion of my privacy. And I know we had a question earlier about how do you assess the impact on an individual? And it's not a bad way of saying, how would I think about it? Do I feel comfortable? Do the hairs stand up on the back of my neck when I read through what we're going to do with CCTV or some sort of AI, etc., etc.? And I agree with you, Fidelma. I have found that the ICO will be amenable to conversations.
Yeah.
They will never give you their opinion, but they'll be open to dialogue. My American clients throw their hands up in the air when I suggest talking to the regulator. It's just something you would not do over there. And perhaps we wouldn't do it with some of our regulators in the EU. But yes, I think, and I agree with you, we're lucky with our own ICO.
Though I could
wonder,
see there, Robert, I see that somebody's expressing the opinion they haven't had that positive experience. Yeah. And I think one of the things I do think is the regulator, as with any organization, is large. They've grown. They have a recruitment and a retention and a skill set problem. But overall, and I think that balance that you've given us, that comparison between the US and even some of the European regulators, yeah, I think we're ahead of the game. And Kirsty, hopefully your future engagements will be, if you do have them, will be more positive.
So we're coming up to 5-2, and I think it would be ideal if we each had some closing thoughts and comments. So I'm going to turn to ladies first, Fidelma.
Thank you. For me, risk management is about understanding the personal data assets you have and understanding how the individual understands what your organization is going to do with them. It doesn't need to be complex, and I would encourage people to create a risk register, no matter how simple, and look at the management of your data assets throughout the entire data life cycle and keep that risk register a living, active document.
Joe?
I would say, on sort of Fidelma's remarks as well, make a start if you haven't already, and that can be low tech. Use the information that the ICO provides. It's one of the tragic consequences of Brexit, sadly, was the ICO's documentation, which was probably some of the best in Europe, used to be beautifully aligned to GDPR, and now it's not, but still going to be useful to you. Use that to make your start, and then maybe when you've got your baseline, consider software later on. But you don't need to go crazy investment-wise to get your program off the ground and start to get some of these things under control. And also, first step, just look at what you're doing. Take a step back, have a look around and reflect before you start getting into this sort of detail.
Yeah, and for me, before I hand back to Simon, I would say doing these types of risk assessments in relation to personal data is no different in a sense from the way in which you think about health and safety in the workplace and other compliance and ethics, to pick up on what Fidelma said, issues. Having something in process, or even something that is fine and shiny and finished, is a good thing, and I would be on that journey. Simon, I'll hand back to you now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Fidelma. It's been really interesting discussion. I've really enjoyed it today. Some very wise words all throughout, in fact, but at the end there, the summaries were terrific. I can't add too much to that, other than if you work with an organisation that really hasn't necessarily got started to understand its risk profile and to be able to tackle it, make a start. You don't have to make it complex. Just try and have a go at it, and you will find that there's templates and people out there that can help, and just discussing it with the management team is a really good start. To talk about how do we get out to grips with the risks is a good start. So we're just about on time, so I'm going to close it there. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thanks ever so much for the people also that have put lots of useful comments and links in the chat. I hope you've all found that useful. Look forward to welcoming you again to another webinar that we do in the future. And thanks again. Goodbye, everyone. Take care. And reminder, recording comes out about this time tomorrow, so you'll get an email with it again. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.